come up and talk about it for a little bit? Okay, we're gonna call this the Ways and Means meeting to order. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, legislation. I was on Ways and Means this morning. Mr. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Alderman Kennedy, Alderman Boyd, Alderwoman Howard,
Present.
Alderman Arnowitz,
He's excused. He has to be excused.
Alderwoman Hubbard, Alderwoman Murphy,
Here.
Alderman Ogilvy, Alderwoman Navarro,
Here.
Alderwoman Middlebrook,
Here.
Chairman Vaccaro,
Present. And Jeffrey Boyd also has to be excused tonight.
You have 6 present, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we're going to start with Cara, if you want to come up. And we are going to have an amendment to this, but if you want to go ahead and explain your bill.
What do we have before us?
We're going to have Board Bill 35 in front of us.
Kara.
Cara's bill.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Want to make a motion to put
Yes,
it
that's
before
30. This is the ordinance numbers.
I don't know if we need a,
Here you go, here you go.
I don't know if we need a motion to put it in front of us, but Lou, do we need a motion to put this in front of us?
You need a motion to put the amendment in front of you.
That's what I thought, not the bill. So Carol, we'll need. So Cara, go ahead, and you want to speak on Board Bill 35.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Legislative Committee. Board Bill number 35 is a pretty simple ordinance that just addresses campaign finance limits within the city of St. Louis. You may remember that just 2 years ago, we did pass a campaign finance limit of $10,000 under the leadership of our colleague Scott Ogilvy, who passed that. At the time that that was passed, the state of Missouri and our surrounding municipalities had no campaign finance limits whatsoever. So the state, you could contribute limitless funds that really were quite astronomical at the time. In November of 2016, the voters of the state of Missouri passed an initiative that limited contributions for statewide offices to $2,600 per donor. That passed with 70% of the Missouri vote, and in the city of St. Louis, it passed with 76% of city voters voting to limit campaign contributions at the state level to $2,600. What we're doing here is just amending our campaign finance law here locally that applies to city elected officials to mirror that which we have now imposed to the state of Missouri. Just last week, on May 8th, St. Louis County passed a very similar measure to limit the campaign contributions in St. Louis County to also mirror that $2,600 limit. That vote passed, that ordinance in St. Louis County passed 6-1 with the only dissenting no opposing some other measures in that ordinance not pertaining to campaign finance. They took a look at some other things. They added some language to prohibit contributions within 90 days of applying for a county contract on either side of it. They also had some other provisions in there that were noted as to the reason behind that single dissenting opinion. In other words, it passed almost unanimously in St. Louis County, so our neighboring municipality has this exact same campaign limit. It applies, excuse me? It will be on their ballot, excuse me, yes. It passed their board, but they are putting it before the voters, the city of St. Louis County. I think this is something that Missouri voters largely support, voters across the country support, and certainly with 76% of St. Louis city voters voting in favor of the statewide limit in 2016, we see that we have a lot of support for this. And with that, I'd like to ask the committee's favorable vote in putting this before the full board.
And we're waiting a minute, but I think we'll go ahead and talk about it because I'm offering one amendment to it that we talked about, and that's the date
Sure.
that would take place. And we're not putting this on a ballot. The county put it on the ballot. We're just going to do it.
We're going to do it by ordinance, that's right. So the chairman has offered what I would consider a friendly amendment to address the date at which this would become effective, and that would put the effective date after the April election to allow for our current limit to be in effect for all the races that are coming up through the April election. And when that amendment gets here, I think it would be appropriate to introduce it at that time.
That's fine. So let me go down.
2019?
2019, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right after the April election.
right after the April
But we're
election.
going to have it, we're going to have it in writing for everybody in just a few minutes. Lou's going to forget it.
And Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, I would take questions on
Yes.
the bill before the amendment was prepared, and that way
Right,
we
that's what
can.
I'm going to go down the list. So we'll start with Alderwoman Howard. Any questions? No questions, okay. Hubbard's not here. Alderwoman Murphy?
No questions. I think I'm glad that we're mirroring and all going to be on the same page. I think that's a good idea. And I know we talked before, this still has nothing to do with, in other words, all my kids can give me $2,600 if they wanted to. It's just individuals. And this
That's
has
correct.
nothing to do with collecting PAC money or anything like that.
That's correct. Each PAC would be limited to, or, excuse me, each candidate would be limited from accepting a PAC contribution of greater than $2,600.
Right.
But the PACs themselves and the contributions to those would be still and continue to be regulated by the state of Missouri, and they're outside of this ordinance.
They're outside. Okay, thank you. And would you, I would like my name put on this too also. Thank you.
Yours is on there.
Vice Chairman Ogilvy?
And Alderman Larry Arnowitz asked to be noted as a co-sponsor as well.
That's fine. You could throw my name on there. I mean, I think pretty much everybody will be on it. Alderman, Vice Chairman Ogilvy, any questions? None. Alderwoman Navarro?
No questions.
Alderwoman Middlebrook?
No questions.
So we're going to be in a little bit of a few-minute delay. Do you have the wording of it, even though it's not in front of all of us?
The wording of the amendment?
Yes.
I don't. That's something that our
It's
clerk
being-
has.
it's-
But we
it's
do
coming.
have, just a moment, we do have one speaker signed up
Oh, sure.
to speak against it.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry, I didn't even think about that.
Damian Johnson, I can bring him up.
Damien, come on up.
Damian is one of my constituents, for the
That's
record.
fine. That's fine. Just,
I voted against the amendment for campaign finance reform 2016. I consistently oppose campaign finance reform as I oppose this bill. I do not believe in limits on free speech.
you know what, I mean, that's a very good point. Does anyone have questions of our speaker? You know,
Just do since we have
oh,
time.
sure. Anybody in the section over there too?
Damien, I just wonder, you said free speech, so you equate money to speech?
Yes, I do, obviously.
Well, the money talks. And other stuff walks.
Yes.
Okay, I get you. I just thought that was interesting.
And if I remember way back when, 15 years ago, there was a $1,200 limit, and then there was a lawsuit exactly based off of the freedom of speech, and it was overturned, and the limit was taken away.
Yeah.
So, it's a good point. You know, it's a good point.
Right.
Any other questions? No. Do you have the amendment?
I have the amendment form. Where is that? Or she's bringing that over right now.
Okay, we're just going to be in a 1-minute delay. Does anybody over there have questions?
Here, I'll go over and check and.
Chairman, could I ask a
how much
question
longer we have.
of Alderwoman Spencer?
Yeah, sure.
This is more of a curiosity, and maybe this is obvious, but how was the number 2,600 arrived at? Why is it not 2,500 or 3,000?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. The vote at the state level was proposed by a ballot initiative, and I'm not sure what the $2,600, where the limit came from, to be honest with you.
Thank you. I didn't know if somebody had calculated. You can buy this many signs and this many radio ads, so here you go. I don't know. All right. Well, thank you.
So we're just going to be in about a 1 or so minute delay while we're waiting for the committee substitute to come over. And I guess anybody that's come to speak for or against the resolution, have you signed up yet? There's sign-up sheets up here for and against the resolution. And that's going to come up pretty shortly, because we'll be done with this in a minute or two. So, you're just going to put it in front of everybody?
Yeah, so right now, the amendment form that says to American, she's making copies of that right now. But this shows the amendment form. This is what was added right here.
Just section 5, the effective date.
Right on page 5, line 17, that was all that was added.
Is the effective date. Okay.
So do you want me to pass these out?
Yeah, I think so.
Get the amendment form?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Kara, if you want to go ahead and come back up. So everybody's going to have the bill as amended in front of them.
The only here.
So, Kara, if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and, so everybody's got the actual amended bill in front of them. And the amendment, everybody has the amended bill in front of them. And the amendment only is on page 5, line 17.
That's for my bill.
We would add the effective date of this ordinance shall be April 2nd, 2019. And that would be the only amendment. And so you have the amended copy of the bill in front of you.
I make a motion to add the amendment to Board Bill 35.
So we have a first and a second. Mr. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Is this to put the amendment in front of the committee, Mr.
This is
Chairman?
just
the
go ahead and-
amendment in
this is
front of the
just go ahead and
committee.
put it in front of us and,
Alderman Kennedy? Alderman Boyd? Alderwoman Howard?
Aye.
Alderman Arnowitz? Alderwoman Hubbard? Alderwoman Murphy? Alderman Vaccaro?
aye.
Or Alderman Ogilvy? Alderwoman Navarro? Alderwoman Middlebrook? President Reed, you have 6 aye votes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now we would take a motion on the bill as amended.
I make a motion to, with the due pass recommendation, to pass Board Bill 35 as amended out of committee.
Do we have a second?
Motion to adopt the amendment.
Okay.
Adopt the amendment.
A motion to adopt.
Adopt, I thought,
Okay.
okay, we just put it before us. To adopt the amendment to Board Bill 35.
And we could do previous roll. Is there any objection to previous roll? No. So we adopted that.
All right, so then now you can move to adopt.
So
the
now we,
35.
yeah. So now I'd look for a motion to adopt Board Bill 35 out as amended.
I move that we adopt Board Bill 35 as amended.
So we have a second.
Second.
And do we have previous?
Previous roll.
Hearing no objection to previous roll. Board Bill 35 is amended, comes out of committee with the due pass recommendation.
Here, here.
Okay, so now we're up to, what's that? Okay,
These are, we do have speakers for resolution.
okay, you're probably going to read them off, but Alderwoman Navarro, you want to come to speak on resolution number 12?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and fellow members of the committee. I'm here tonight to talk about resolution number 12. And I do have some changes. I'll propose an amendment, but first I'm just going to talk a little bit, just big picture, what this resolution does, and then I'll share with you a few of the minor changes that I'm proposing. So I want to give you all a little bit of background on this resolution. So this resolution was drafted before the renewed discussion about word reduction that we've been having most recently. So, and that conversation pursuant to Board Bill 25, which proposes to put word reduction back on the ballot, put it back before the voters. So first what I want to do is explain what this resolution is not. This resolution does not touch the redistricting question. That is a major question, a very big and important question that this board will need to address in the future, but that is not the subject of this resolution. Also, the aim of this resolution is not to weigh in on whether St. Louis City should have 28 or 14 wards. There may be information gained from the advisory committee that this resolution sets up that would inform individual opinions, but it is not about making recommendations about the size of the Board of Aldermen. This resolution is about process. So with any change, there are challenges and opportunities, and the change in this case is really up to the voters. So whether it's the voters in 2012 or up to the voters in 2019, the change that we are talking about is a change that will be decided by the voters. How we carry out that change is up to us, up to the Board of Aldermen. And so this resolution sets up an advisory committee and a process to look at the steps necessary if we move to 14 aldermen, for how this board would remain a strong advocate for the citizens and how we can ensure that citizens have access to a responsive government under a new Board of Aldermen. So if we reduce to 14 wards, we have time now to put in place any changes we think are needed to address the concerns of residents and the concerns of aldermen, many of which we've already heard in the discussions around Board Bill 25. So this resolution would have the legislative committee convene an advisory committee of residents and aldermen to hear input from residents, city departments, community organizations, other advisors, and the big overall topics to be addressed in this committee would look at what are the impacts on reducing the board from 28 to 14. So looking at things such as the delivery of constituent services, how would that happen with 14 aldermen? Looking at the function of the board and also the capacity in terms of what sort of support staff would be needed if we reduce to 14 aldermen. Also looking at the various ordinances that are ward specific, looking at ward capital budgets. There are a variety of just details that would need to be addressed if we go from 28 to 14. And if we do this now, we give ourselves time to put that plan in place so that we are ready, regardless of what happens with ward reduction. If we go to 14 wards, we are going to need to be prepared. So the idea is that this advisory committee would make recommendations to the board, potentially would put recommendations to maybe to other city departments, and then it would be up to those departments and up to the board whether or not to implement those. So the resolution calls for a 6-month interim report once they meet. So they would come back to the legislation committee and share a 6-month interim report, and then a full report 1 year later. And the changes, would you like me to talk about address
I mean,
the minor
let's bring
tweaks?
them up one by one. Let's,
Okay.
tell you what, let's let the people that came to speak, we'll let them come up. And then, yeah, then I would like to address different changes that you kind of worked out. But let's go ahead and, if we can have and this is the only sheet here?
Yes.
So I can't read that, so I'll let you read it.
You have
Rasheen Aldred,
and
yeah.
then before that there is
hang on.
Jennifer Nalahan or something.
Jennifer,
Malik.
It's
It's Jennifer.
Jennifer, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with
Right.
names.
So, do I just go? Jennifer Nalick. So in reading this, I'm not sure it says that there is a advisory committee to give input. This doesn't necessarily touch on who makes the final decisions based on what the lines are, correct?
Right, so what the advisory committee would come back, and of course, my hopes would be that this gets out. If it does go back to the ballot, that we can, this should have been done before we did the last vote, but if it goes to 14, this committee, at least we can put out something saying, well, this is what it would look like, this is, you know, it's not gonna change anything other than say that, and I could have the Alderwoman speak to it, but it's just gonna say, this is how it would look, where's the money gonna go, how's the ward? Not
It's
so much
unclear to me,
the-
though, that who, okay, so they give all this input, and, you know, I do marketing as a job, and there's a certain aspect of give people a way to air their grievances so that you can keep it all in one place, but then you're not, who is actually making the decision on how these lines are drawn? Who is in charge of that?
Yeah, but, and I can, but this bill doesn't touch on
So this
that.
bill has nothing to do with drawing lines. So this bill is really about what sort of changes need to be made at the Board of Aldermen or within city services so that we can continue to deliver constituent services and hopefully can distribute them more equitably than we're doing right now. So if there's going to be a committee about drawing lines, that's a completely separate committee, a completely separate resolution. So that's why this advisory committee would be making recommendations to the board. And some of those things could be these sorts of support positions need to be in place. Or we need to look at how Citizen Service Bureau inputs requests, because right now so many things go through the Board of Aldermen. If we go from 28 to 14 without making any changes, I think all of us know we're going to be overwhelmed. So we have an opportunity here to look at how do we distribute city services? How do we ensure that they are being distributed equitably and it doesn't just come down to who your alderman is? So hopefully that addresses.
So is the legislative committee the body that decides, because this is just for input, and you listen to people, then the legislative committee actually decides what the distribution actually looks like?
So the advisory committee would put forth recommendations to the legislation committee, and then depending on what those are, so some of them might be a matter of just changes that need to happen internally at the Board of Aldermen. They might be administrative changes. They might require budgetary changes. They might be recommendations saying that we think Citizen Service Bureau should have this thing or available online. And so some of them might require legislation, some of them might be simple administrative changes, maybe their rules changes. It really depends on what they are and who the recommendation is directed at.
All right, well, depending on which changes are made and who makes that decision, I, as a resident of the South Side, also as somebody who grew up here and lived here until I was 33 and then moved away and came back, and that experience changed how I see this city, I think that there are a lot of issues that people who have been here a while just are just missing. And I'm on the South Side. I would ask you, please do not try to make everything equal for us. We don't need it. I do not want to live in a city that is bottom heavy on resources and prosperity and opportunity for people. So I don't know who would be making those decisions, but that is what I am imploring you to do. Thank you.
So ultimately, and I won't be the head of legislation because it'll change because everybody wants to be the head of legislation when the map's drawn. Actually, legislation is who actually draws the map. So a much more senior alderman than me would get that. As far as advisory committee, you know, I believe, although Terry is going to kind of head it up for us, I hope, it's going to be citizens as well as, and if
There's a whole list of things that it could be, but I just hope that is,
if you have time for meetings,
okay, go ahead.
leave your name up here, and you know we're going to look for Board of Aldermen people, but we're actually going to like to see a couple people from different areas. I wouldn't mind seeing someone, you know, because I certainly, from my neighborhood, which is way south, I have concerns that if we start to say, well, the money is better spent over here, and it starts to take money away from my neighborhood, I certainly have concerns, you know. So I would look for that committee, and actually it would come up pretty fast, and then they would meet at their own schedule. I would look for that, but I would hope we get input faster than 6 months, because I would want it before the April election if this is back on the ballot again. And that's a big if too, but if it's back on the ballot, I would like everybody to be able to make an intelligent decision based off of facts, not what they think the facts are. Some people say, well, if we reduce the Board of Aldermen, we're going to save a bunch of money. That's not true. It's actually going to cost more money to reduce the Board of Aldermen. If we say, well, it's going to be more equitable if we reduce the Board of Aldermen, I don't know about that, because again, when they talk about money being distributed in an, you know, in an area that needs more, right now, each ward gets an equal amount of money. You know, so if you're interested, certainly just give us your name and phone number. I would hope that we start to put a committee together right away, and I'm hoping that long before April, that committee reports back here. And I would like the committee to be diverse.
I will do that, and just in closing, to say that, you know, well, what if money leaves my ward? That is exactly what is wrong with the way that we run things, and we can't keep doing it that way, and we can't just keep looking out for our own little communities and our own little neighborhoods.
I know,
So,
but as an alderman of one community, I certainly watch out for my community.
I appreciate that, but I would prefer to have an alderman or alderwoman of my ward who looked out for the whole city. That's my personal preference.
But so,
I'm not saying any person does or does not. I'm just saying that is my preference.
well, no, I mean, hey, I'm the chairman, I can.
Go right ahead.
Does anyone have questions for?
No, sir.
Anyway, so next up was Rashid. Rashid, you're next up. Yeah, and it would need you to state your name.
Okay.
And I'm sure I messed it up anyway, so.
Rasheen Aldrich. And I put my name in the middle, not necessarily against or for, more trying to understand the resolution. So in thinking of this resolution, it kind of, as a former Ferguson Commission member, it makes me think of that process. And it was a 1.5 year long process. It was a intentional, lengthy process. I would be curious of how we would go about picking the individuals that would serve on this committee. I'm curious, with us being in a kind of finance, I think our credit or something just recently dropped also this week. How much is this also going to cost us if we take this on seriously? Looking at outside of, like you say, not necessarily the number, if it is going to go to 14, or we should also, I think, with the resolution, probably be thinking about knowing that there's a lot of energy and a lot of concern with keeping 28 as well, not just saying 14, but seeing how do we look at this as an equitable process if we also stay at 28, because that ideally seems to be everyone's goal, not necessarily the number, but making it a fair process. And in doing that, like I said, I'm just curious how this board would be set up, who would be the decision makers in on this board, who would have the last say so. Would the recommendations, just like the Ferguson Commission recommendations, would it just be recommendations? And like I say, what really is the concerning part is the cost. Like, how is this gonna come together? Who's gonna pay for the meeting, the transcribe, the being able to put this out on social media, snacks, large attendance rooms, all things that, as a former Ferguson Commission member, it was a lot that went into it, and it was expensive, but it was a lot of also donors. So, like I say, with us being kind of in a finance trouble, it's a lot of just questions that I have about the resolutions, and a concern of making sure we don't keep saying just 14, because I know we say we're not necessarily looking at the redrawing of the lines, but we're looking, because there was a bill passed to say 14. So if the bill is passed in 2019 to say keep it at 28, then do we, how do we go back, or what do we do with the resolution? So that's just more of my comment.
Well, and again, if you're thinking you might want to be on that, just let's get your name in that. We want a committee that's going to, and this isn't a board bill, it's a resolution. So that committee will meet and then come back, and the whole committee may or may not even agree on everything, but maybe they can agree on something.
Yeah. But like I said, I'm just more, the energy and no matter on what side you're on, it is very high, and it's high for passionate reasons on both sides, right? So It's easy, and no, and I'm not saying this in a disrespectful way, Chair, but it's easy, for like me or maybe others in this room to be aware of stuff like this and participate. But I think about, the folks that are in the senior buildings in my ward, right, that are not tuned in, but also this will affect them. So how are we going to get that word out? And how are we going to move that process forward to make it where everyone is part of that process and taking in concerns of transportation or all these different things? How is it going to happen? And I think we should have kind of been having that conversation. And I know this alderwoman is new to the board, but should have been doing that beforehand, especially also as people are very passionate and saying, hey, there's a concern of even reducing, and we want equitable wards too, but we feel like it should be at this number, and the resolution kind of, at least from what I hear, just says more of like, because we're going to shrink down to 14, let's have this conversation. How do we address the concerns of the
Well, I think-
28 as well?
I think what it would get at is what it would look like. I almost think it's helpful, because of course, I'm one of the ones that felt 28 should stay, but I think it would be helpful. I think if people understand what it would look like, I think it's helpful. And I, for one, I'm interested to know myself. So, I think it would be interesting, and if you want to sit on that, I don't think it's going to be nearly as eventful as the Ferguson Commission. It's just going to be a group of people to have discussion, to come back and say, this is what we believe it would look like if it goes to that.
Yeah. I just, within this process, and I just, once again, I hope that it's done and in a, in no disrespect, like I say, Chair, that it's just not just a few discussions, that it is a thought out process where we can bring one St. Louis together to have this conversation. 14, 28, how do we move equitable, knowing that it is pretty
Well, you're
divided right now.
a committee man in the city, right?
Yes, sir.
So I would hope that you could bring this information back to the committee, who also could, get information out. So I would say if you're interested, let us know and we'll get you on there.
I got you.
Okay. Did anybody, I know it was a very short sign-up sheet and some people walked in. Anybody else want to speak on this before we go
Mr. Chair,
back?
could I address some of
Oh,
Rashid's
absolutely.
questions?
I'm sorry, yes. Oh, did anyone have questions of Rashid? Okay, no, please.
I appreciate Mr. Aldrich's questions, and those are actually the same questions that I have been thinking about through this process. And I'm trying to make sure I address all of them. So one, some of the amendments that I have address the question that we may not actually go down to 28, or go down to 14. So I do want to address that. And I think if we do stay at 28, I think it would be helpful for the legislation committee and this advisory committee to determine at that point whether they feel that they are taking in information that would be helpful to the board of 28. Because I think there are a lot of issues with 28 aldermen that are going to remain if we have 14. So there may be information that comes out of this advisory committee that is relevant. Like I said, when I drafted this, at this point, we weren't looking at putting it back on the ballot yet, but I think that's a legitimate question for the advisory committee to think about. And I think if ward reduction goes on the April 2019 ballot or the overturning of ward reduction, and it's determined that we're going to stay at 28, I think what we'd want to know then from the advisory committee is, would it make sense for them to keep meeting and come up with a final report that would be applicable to 28? The other question in terms of who would be on this, again, it is a resolution, it's not a board bill, so it doesn't have the same authority as a board bill. To me, this is really about getting a conversation going. I do think it's important that it is an inclusive conversation. So I think one of the things the legislation committee could do is make sure that we have representation from various parts of the city, make sure that we are hearing from a variety of neighborhood groups. And so I think that's something that the legislation committee would determine, how are we going to get those people in the room. In terms of the cost of this, I run a nonprofit. I think we could get free space. I think we could reach out to one of the institutions and find somebody who would help donate time to facilitate time. And I think we'd have a series of meetings, hopefully around the city, so that we would give people access. I don't think we are charged with quite the same thing as the Ferguson Commission was. Again, I see this as a conversation about what are the logistics behind reducing the board from 28 to 14. But those are all excellent questions, and I think they are things that we could continue to address.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I am looking at one of the CSB reports that I made numbers of times. I just wanted to address this because I think this is relevant. You are looking at how going forward, possible CSB services report. I lived in multiple wards throughout my stay in St. Louis, 28, Ward 10, and Ward 20, and it's my last ward. I just want to mention that it was Ward 20 of the third ward that I lived in was the first time I learned of CSB and neighborhood stabilization services. I always knew about aldermen and alderwomen. So going forward, I will wish this advisory committee will find out how many people know about Citizen Service Bureau, how many people are informed about neighborhood stabilization, or how effective are the NSOs, what practices could both the NSO, the Board of Aldermen, can do. I noticed that sometimes some incidents takes all three NSO, Board of Aldermen, and Citizen Service Bureau to handle an incident. Sometimes it takes two, sometimes it takes one. So that is one of the things that is a concern of me about me. I did vote in the election when we reduced the ward. I also plan to vote in this election. That is a concern that I will like this advisory committee to address, whether we go down to one or two. How effective are these services, and what can we do different?
Hopefully the committee will come back. Does anyone have questions? No. Anyone else? Then, thank you. Tom, you had?
Members of the committee, my name is Thomas Bauer. I think something that's been lost in the arguments in favor of lessening the number of aldermen is, if we look back at the time when the charter was enacted, the population of the city of St. Louis is approximately what it is now. So these arguments that we had 800,000 or 500,000 at one point, those really don't hold up as a justification for reducing the size of the Board of Aldermen. Also, there's been nothing that would show that reducing the size of the Board of Aldermen would save money, because I think the thought is you'd have to bring on a lot of professional staff and increase salaries. So that's not a good argument in favor. Another thing to think of is members of the board are familiar with the duties of an alderman and what you do in the community. And if you double your size, it's going to be very difficult for any alderman to actually get out and go to every neighborhood meeting they have per month. Normally, I think what you've got in most wards is 4 or 5 neighborhood associations. So most weeks you have one to go to, that's one evening, and another, maybe one week you've got 2 to go to. But it's crucial that you're able to go out into the community and do this. And also, you've got to have sort of a constant awareness of your geography and what's happening on various streets. And if the area is larger, you're going to end up with a system that is dominated by bureaucrats, and the aldermen aren't going to be doing their current outreach function. Because essentially, you're elected to be members of a legislative body, but what you really do in practice is you're like a city manager for a small community. You're like you're currently representing communities in the 28 wards that are larger than most of the communities in St. Louis County. If you should reduce the number of aldermen in the city of St. Louis, if you want to look at it in terms of better together arguments, it flies in the face of that, because a community like Shrewsbury has, what, 24,000, and they've got 3 aldermen. There are a lot of communities that don't have the number of constituents in St. Louis County that we're going to have in single wards. So you would have people in St. Louis City having less access to their most directly elected official. And I think that's detrimental. And also, when you think about it, with 28 members, there's less susceptibility to the body being influenced by money interests, because you don't need as much money to run. And in order to do something deleterious and corrupt, you would have to have half the current body. Because I know this body was very influential. You stopped the possible takeover of the water department of St. Louis City. There's also very current and important issues pertaining to the airport. And these are the things that need a larger number of people to think about the ramifications and to vote. And if you think also in terms of the welfare of the political system, this Board of Aldermen has been a source of great leadership potential going forward. Remember, Dick Gebhardt was on this board. Dick went to Congress. We've had mayors that came off of this board. Ben Shamel went on and he became a mayor, and a pretty good progressive mayor. People can fault anybody in government, but he did a lot to move the city forward. And so I think that as you're currently constituted, you're doing a very good job for running the city of St. Louis. And I guess something else you need to know, or you know, but the general public doesn't know, is all the individual pieces of legislation that you have to do that pertain to development. Those are individual board bills. And so you might have to do a plan unit reduction ordinance, or you might have to do a tax abatement. And these are things where the alderman, who's the one who's going to have to introduce the board bill, should be intimately involved with the details so that he makes sure that they're proper and that they're good for the community. If you go to a larger system, all of these things that are really your legislative functions are going to be handled by bureaucrats who will be bringing them to you. And I think, that goes against the public interest. And if the public is dissatisfied with an alderman now, it's much easier to have an election, have a change in a smaller district. So I think in the larger districts, it would be money that counts. In the smaller district, it's people that count. Those are my thoughts.
Actually, you're one meeting late, but this was stuff we brought up would have been brought up last meeting. But if you're interested in being on that committee, let us know. And I would like to hopefully have this committee formed within the next couple of weeks. So
All right, great.
if there's an interest, let us know. Is there anyone else, even though we didn't do the sign-up sheet, it's there, anyone else want to speak on this resolution? Alderwoman Navarro, oh yeah, well, yes, sure, I'm sorry.
Start with the senior alderman.
Well, does anyone have, Terry?
I understand it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have some amendments or changes?
Yes, I do. Do you want me to go through those now?
Did you want
I don't have
questions of
anything
the
else.
speaker, Carol?
If, no, I have questions of the sponsor.
Oh yeah, no, we're bringing her up now, that's what we're gonna do.
Okay,
I didn't have any.
okay.
You go right ahead. I mean, I have,
So, okay, I'm sorry.
technically I have some, but I just wanted to see what the amendments were.
So,
That may take care of my questions.
okay.
But if
so we'll
anybody else
wait.
has
So,
questions.
Alderwoman Howard, any general questions?
I guess just for the purpose of clarity, you're going to be looking at the ramifications of the reduction, ward reduction.
Right, if
okay?
we reduce the wards, what would be the effects?
Okay.
Right, and how would we, what are
Okay.
some recommendations to address those?
So basically, you're kind of going to do an evaluation and what things could happen when we do it, and if it comes to pass. And then we'll also be able to take away information on how to better serve our constituents, even if the reduction doesn't come to pass.
Yes, well said.
Okay, okay. So this is a resolution, it's not law, just to be clear, and that these will be hopefully will derive some recommendations on how to proceed forward in either case, whether we reduce the Board of Aldermen or we keep it the same.
Yes, I think, yeah, that's fair, yes.
Okay.
And I mean, for example, you know, the Board of Aldermen, we don't have any authority over, NSOs, for example, are not under the Board of Aldermen, but I know a lot of people have had conversations about, it'd be really nice to keep 28. And so it might be, it would be good for the Board of Aldermen to have that discussion, you know, would we like to keep 28? How would that work? Is there another scenario in which that is more effective? And then that would just be a way for us to have that conversation and potentially make recommendations.
Okay. I just wanted, because we have people that seem that are on both sides here, but I think that just not to misinterpret that the sole purpose of this is to study the reduction of the board. It's to help us align with what would help make our jobs easier, along with that if we do reduce.
Yes.
It would provide that information. Okay.
Yes, thank you for the clarification, Alderwoman.
Okay.
Alderwoman Murphy,
I think it's a good idea.
Vice Chairman Ogilvy, you're up there already. Alderwoman Middlebrook. And although Alderwoman Howard knows, the budget came to us with only half the NSOs. So there's really only half the NSOs
Okay.
in the budget.
Let's do this.
Yeah.
I'm there with you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
may I ask a
absolutely,
question now?
yes.
Thank you. But the report is also supposed to, from my understanding and reading it, make recommendations about the transition process itself? Because it's just how it's worded to me. It says,
Let's see.
direct the legislation committee to convene an advisory committee for the purpose of evaluating the necessary steps required to transition.
So, I mean, by that I meant, you know, if we have, you know, we have got 28 aldermen in a certain number of offices, we have a certain number of secretarial staff, you know, so as we transition, you know, what does that look like? So those logistics of the transition, I mean,
Okay.
so just in terms of going from 28 to 14, what are the sorts of things we're going to need to look at? I
Not
don't know if I'm
necessar-
understanding your question.
Yeah, not necessarily to make a recommendation. The board should have a special committee to look at, to do the redistricting, you know, the actual transition.
Right, yeah, not
Not that portion.
that,
Okay.
not that.
All right.
This
That's
is
all.
really pretty boring, mundane stuff. I mean, it really is just the logistics of what happens when we go from 28 to 14. And one of the big things is we all field a lot of calls about constituent services, for example, and we know that's a concern of the community. So how can we prepare ourselves to continue to deliver constituent services? How could we improve on that and deliver them even more equitably? What sort of recommendations do we need to, what sort of changes need to happen? And this bill, or this resolution would not mandate any changes, just to get that conversation going.
The
And
other-
it may recommend that we need further study in certain
Right.
areas.
The other thing is that you say that you want them to report back to the Board of Aldermen? Yeah, I know you say the City of St. Louis.
Let's see, so it would be after, let's see, there should be a 6-month, there's an interim report to the Legislation Committee, and then at a year, it would be with the Board of Aldermen at a public hearing well, I said at a public hearing of the Legislation Committee. I'm open to how we do that, what we think is the best process. I guess I was thinking it might be something like this, where that advisory committee would come back, share that with this committee, I'm open to suggestions if you think there's another way to do that. I think it should be made available online. I mean, the legislation committee could kind of go through those details.
Other subcommittees, so this is, you're calling it an advisory committee, not really a subcommittee. So typically in those kind of, even a subcommittee, the report is adopted by the subcommittee members that report it back to the general committee, who in turn reports that to the full board or whoever, whatever body is there. And so I just wanted to get clarity as how your vision was on that.
So I was thinking they would come back to the legislation committee with their report. And partly just because I don't know the logistics of if we would, how they present to the entire full board of aldermen. I mean, I just haven't been here long enough to see a committee report to the full board.
If the legislation committee does not adopt the advisory committee's report, because it's really serving at the behest of, or at the leisure of this committee and its chair, I can't see it being able to release that report without this committee endorsing it.
And you have way more experience than I do, so that's sort of why I was kind of saying that under your direction on this, because
Okay.
this is definitely some new territory for me, something that you've probably been through. And I
Okay.
know that my understanding is that you guys have even talked over the amendments.
We did speak on,
so-
haven't seen them.
I guess my question would be, as we start to do these amendments, do you guys feel like you would rather do a committee sub? I know that was one of the things you were looking at, and then put something together collectively, and we pass it out like Friday morning or something like that, or you want to go through it's kind of just whatever you guys want to do. I want to make
For
sure
the lot?
that whatever we do makes sense.
Could I at least share the amendments
Oh,
that I do have, and we could
absolutely.
see
And see
where we
what-
need to go from there?
Yes.
So,
So it would be Monday. Okay, I'm sorry.
I'll make a motion.
Well,
I move to put this amendment before the committee. I have 3 amendments.
yeah, motion to put the amendment number 1 in front of the committee.
Okay. Can I have one? Okay. So I moved, well, I'll let you
So
look at it.
you can go and start speaking on the amendment.
Okay, so Amendment 1 adds the words "unless the voters decide otherwise" at the very beginning. So as I said, when I drafted this, we had the word reduction on the books moving forward. In light of I want to recognize that we are in this process of possibly reconsidering that decision. So what this would do is on page 1, line 4, and I emailed the numbered version, so maybe everybody will be able to get that. But essentially, in the second whereas clause, after beginning January 1, 2022, it would say, unless the voters decide otherwise, we're going to reduce the wards. That one is pretty basic.
I move to accept amendment number 1 to board bill, or resolution number
You move to
Well-
adopt it.
yeah.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any talk on the amendment? Any discussion on the amendment? Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Kennedy,
Aye.
Alderman Boyd, Alderwoman Howard,
Aye.
Alderman Arnowitz, Alderwoman Hubbard, Alderwoman Murphy, Alderman Ogilvy, Alderwoman Navarro,
Aye.
Alderwoman Middlebrook, Chairman Vaccaro,
Aye.
President Reed. You have 7 aye votes, Mr. Chairman.
So we have 7 aye votes. Amendment number 1 to resolution 12 is put in there. You want to make a motion to put resolution 2 in front of us?
I move to put amendment number 2 to resolution number 12 before the committee.
You want to go ahead and discuss the resolution? Amendment, I'm sorry.
So amendment 2 adds a a deadline, puts in a date, May 31st, 2019, as the day in which the final report would be due. Right now, the resolution says 1 year, and I wanted to put a date in there. So it says, by May 31st, 2019, unless the voters choose to maintain the Board of Aldermen as a body of 28 in the interim. In light of some of the discussion about there may be some very good recommendations that come out of this advisory committee, even if we stay at 28, I'd be open to, having them convene. I just didn't want to make the assumption that this body is going to go ahead and make recommendations for 14 if we do indeed stay at 28.
Any questions?
I do. I'm not I follow what you're talking about. I just don't follow the lines.
Oh,
Page
right.
2,
So
line 26.
I did email, Lou, I did email the version with the lines in it.
Yes.
If you all want that. But so it would be beginning on page 2, let's see, line 11. Well, it's not going to correspond on this one because this
It
one doesn't
does
have the
not.
numbers on it.
I was
But
counting
there
on
is a copy out there with the numbers on it.
Committee substitute has the numbers on the line.
If you look at the committee substitute,
I don't have a committee
I don't
sub.
have it in front of me either.
Oh, okay.
it's numbered correctly, and actually, they're marked in bold.
I don't have one either. Does everybody have that? Does anybody over there need a copy?
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and these numbers, I realize, probably correspond with the committee
Right. This
substitute
makes
as opposed to the original one.
I move to adopt amendment
Well,
number
we're
2,
still- We're still.
or did we still?
I see it now. You
Alderman
gave me the one with
Kennedy,
the
any other
lines on it.
questions?
No, I see it with the lines on it.
Okay.
Okay, anyone have any questions on the amendment?
I move to adopt amendment number 2 to resolution number 12,
I second.
We have first and second.
previous roll.
No objection
Previous
to,
roll? Yeah.
no objection to previous roll.
I move to put amendment number 3 to resolution number 12 before the committee.
Okay, go ahead and let us know what.
So amendment number 3 regards the individuals that are listed in the final paragraph to be part of the committee. And after some discussion, we looked at having those various representatives of agencies, of city agencies, being available to give input to the committee, but not having a seat on the committee. So that is what this change is. Instead of those representatives of the agencies serving on the committee, they give input to the committee.
I think that's a fantastic idea.
Any questions on the resolution, Alderman Kennedy?
Thank you. Okay, let me see now. Reginald, insert the following. So the thought is to not have them as members of the committee.
Correct. The representatives of city agencies. So they would still be called before the committee to give input, but they would not be the ones on the committee making the final recommendations.
So again, for insert.
I thought that was your recommendation. If I misunderstood, I'm sorry.
No, it is.
Okay.
It just seems like, but you still say representatives from various city agencies after saying, let me see now.
So this
Oh, no,
is
the advisory committee will
input.
seek input.
From
Thank you.
residents,
I got you.
representatives from various city
got you.
agencies.
I follow it, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee?
No, I move that we adopt amendment number 3 to resolution number 12,
I second.
previous roll.
Any objection to previous roll? Seeing no objection to previous roll, amendment number 3 to resolution 12 passes committee. Now we have the resolution as amended in front of us, even though it's committee substitute.
Yeah, there is another version that I sent around maybe 15, 20 minutes ago that says as amended, as opposed to committee substitute. I don't know if that...
I don't think I've got that one.
No, I emailed it to you, Lou, so unless you opened up
Oh,
your
I'm
computer
sorry, I
and
have
sent it
not.
to be printed.
I have not, so it's not been printed. I apologize. I will send it to, if,
Terry? He's gonna s-
Teresa.
Or
I'm
Teresa?
going to email you.
Why did I say Terry?
To-
Jeez.
Sorry, I should have sent it to both of you. Oh.
No.
Could I say one more thing, and one, before we vote?
We still got to vote on this. We're not adjourned. We haven't even adopted the resolution. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that I think in light of some of the public testimony, I think it is very important that we get a broad base of input on this committee. And so I'd really urge not only the members of this committee, but all of the aldermen to suggest, to let their constituents know that there is this opportunity, and also to suggest people to be on the committee. So whether that's members of neighborhood organizations, members of community organizations, anyone else that you think would be important. I think it's really important that all of us as members of the Board of Aldermen are going to be invested in the recommendations that come out of this. So I really hope that we get a very robust discussion going.
Even though we're waiting for it, I mean, we sort of have it because we have it as a committee substitute. I think we'll just go down the line. Alderman Kennedy, any questions on this as it's amended?
Yeah, just, it's back to the reporting.
Okay.
The way it reads, it reports its findings back to the Board of Aldermen at a meeting of the Legislation Committee. It does not necessarily present the information first to the Legislation Committee and then to the full board.
Would you want to make an amendment that we add that?
So we could have it say, so they will share its findings and recommendations with the legislation committee.
Unless there was some rationale behind why you had it this way. Okay.
No, I was trying to, based on just my limited experience, trying to figure out what would be most efficient, which body would be most efficient for them to go before. But I think it makes sense for it to go before the legislation committee, and then the legislation committee would either adopt it or not.
Did you have an amendment? Do you have an amendment then, or?
Yeah, I would, yes. Let me see that.
So
We'd have to
we're-
have it written up.
Blue's going to help us write it up. So we're going to have an amendment number 4 coming up here. in a
We'll share
minute.
its findings and recommendations with the legislation committee to be adopted and,
And upon its adoption, it shares, something like that. You know.
okay.
Sure.
We're just going to take a minute. This way we get this out. And this way you don't get a whole bunch of floor substitutes, or we start getting, you know,
Yeah, thank you.
get it as clean as we can coming out here, and we don't have to worry about it. And it'll take a few minutes. Does anybody in any of the other aldermen have questions or anything? Annie, come on up.
Can we go home?
The question is, can we go home? The answer is no.
Negative.
So, she's been here to chair meetings before. She's in there, she's not.
Yeah, that's true, then that means the other part.
Tracy, they may even have more stuff for you.
Well, yeah, we're striking
While we're hanging out, I just want to say thank you to everybody that did take time out of their night to come watch this. A lot of times, sometimes it's a lot more exciting. Like the last group that was here was, you know, sometimes it's like this. And that's probably what I'd rather be. I'm like, but I'm old.
This isn't Days of Our Lives.
Sometimes it's more exciting. I think the last one was a lot more,
Sometimes it is a bit of a circus.
sometimes it is.
But sometimes we're pretty good at it.
Of its grades. You've seen our North Sarah development. I was not there probably before. I worked to do and got the plan together, and it took all the way to 2000.
Come over and ask everyone, you can do whatever you want. This is America.
Well, now you can.
That I will tell Teresa to,
We still have the cameras on?
Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
We haven't adjourned.
Why don't we take a break?
We could, but I think they got it together. Lou, do we have what we need, or you want to adjourn for?
a couple of minutes.
Okay, we're in the couple, why don't you go and explain what it's going to say while they're typing it up? And
Oh, so the Fourth Amendment that we just discussed was saying that the final report would be shared with this committee, with the Legislation Committee, and if this committee adopts it, then it will go to the full Board of Aldermen.
And that's basically,
That's it.
so it's going to be about another 2-minute wait. but-
Exactly what the language is. So beginning on page 2, line 14, we will
Okay.
strike the words "Board of Aldermen at a public hearing of the Legislation Committee," and insert "with the Legislation Committee and upon its adoption by the committee with the Board of Aldermen at the next regular meeting of the Board of Aldermen."
But we still have to have it in front of us in writing, I would, or can we? Or can we go ahead and vote on it the way it is?
Can I just ask the sponsor, since this is becoming so labor intense, just the logistics of getting this, I don't think there's much disagreement about this. Would it behoove you to maybe put this on for maybe one day next week and we could get it out and it would be just a week behind?
Is there anything else do you think there are going to be other change? I mean, we're just waiting for that
No,
one to be printed.
I'm just saying, I don't know, we have a limited staff, clerical staff, and I'm just saying it might be a while.
But they're printing right now. I believe this is the last amendment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think if we're patient, we'll have this out in the next 10
I will
10
be the
minutes.
patient. Thank you.
We'll be out of here by 8 o'clock.
I'll take you out after.
And you're taking us all out?
That's right.
Alderwoman Middlebrook's taking us out for drinks. Not Middlebrook, I am so sorry. Well, you could,
You pick
you
up
know
our
what,
son
you
on the
could.
way.
Oh, she's got to get home.
Yeah, we have to pick up her son on the way.
She got to pick up her. Oh, okay, well, I was trying to get you off the hook.
But I appreciate all of your time this evening. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll have this out. Yeah, Teresa went back for, huh? Well, he was off today, and yeah. Well, we could use a printer. Only with, well, when the sponsors of the bill asked me to. Because they feel if something should have public input, then I think it's good to have the public. I know, but yeah. So, no, I try to do it if the sponsor of a bill, here we come. If the sponsor of a bill asks, we do that. We should thank Teresa for being our volunteer runner of the night.
Thank you,
Okay.
Teresa.
So I will actually make a motion. We put amendment number 4 to resolution 12 in front of us. We have a second.
Second.
And
Where'd the alderwoman go?
already
There you are.
discussed it.
You already discussed it. If we're fine with that,
Discussed it.
we'll take I'll make a motion. We adopt amendment number 4 to resolution number 12.
Second, previous roll.
Okay, now we have the resolution as amended in front of us. Do we have a motion?
We just had the motion.
We adopted the amendment to the, right, because we adopted the amendment.
Amendment 4 to resolution.
We
12.
adopted the amendment. Now we're adopting the resolution as amended,
Oh,
the whole thing as amended.
second.
So we have a motion by Vice Chairman Scott out there,
Second.
and a second.
Previous roll.
Any objection to previous roll? Seeing no objection to previous roll, we pass resolution number 12 as amended out of committee, and we are now adjourned. And we did it before 8 o'clock.